You're listening to Up An Octave, a podcast by Sonivia, the podcasting agency that believes that women and non-binary people deserve to take up space in the podcasting industry because our thoughts, voices, and stories matter. Here you'll learn how to make dope podcasts that inspire, educate, convert, and most importantly, make your voice shine. I'm your host, Rue Spence, and I'm here to take podcasting up an octave. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Up An Octave. Today we are talking about finding your perfect podcasting style. So this is for you if you are still in the process of starting your show, but it's also helpful for you if you are feeling like it's time for a rebrand or you're just not feeling particularly connected to the style of your show as you've been doing it. So first, let's talk about what are the different styles of podcast. And for this, I'm not talking about fun, funnel, or fandom podcasts. I am talking more about the nature of the podcast itself. If it's interview-based, narrative storytelling, solo commentary, panel discussions, hybrids, etc. So let's get on into it and get you back out the door into making a podcast you love. There's a lot of different ideas on what you can do with your podcast. And there are a lot of different ideas that work well or don't for each type of podcast. And they're all going to appeal to a different audience, and they're all going to feel different for you as the creator. So finding something that feels really good to make is going to be incredibly helpful in making sure that you are making the show that makes sense. Now, I want to just clear the elephant out of the room. There is a huge discussion to be had on video podcasts versus audio-only podcasts. As you know, I am here to teach and preach and bow in adoration before audio-only podcasts. Those are my sweet spot. That's what I like to work with. That's what I like to create, and that's what I like to consume. But there is a huge space for video podcasts, and if that is something that feels good to you to create, if you never really left your YouTube vlog girly era, that may be your sweet spot, and that's awesome. So make that video podcast, get you a ring light, set up your really nice camera, and make it happen. But for the sake of today's show, I'm really going to be talking about audio only, though any of these styles can have a camera on and be made into video podcasts. So just wanted to get that out the way, and let's get into it. So for an interview-based podcast, that's where you're going to have yourself as the host, and then you're going to bring on guests and interview them. This could be interviewing people who know more than you, i.e. JVNs getting curious. This could be bringing on experts in a particular niche, i.e. Thoughts from a Page, where Cindy brings in different authors. So those kind of, where you are always the consistent host, but you have this revolving door of different guests. The cool thing about that is it allows people to find you by connecting with some of their favorites. So if someone's like, oh my gosh, I really love this author, I really love this athlete, I really love this professional chef, whatever your niche is, people who follow them, if you are marketing well and if you're asking your guests to market well, people are going to find your show by following your guests, and that can be really exciting. This allows also for different perspectives, for different conversations. I think it helps you as a person grow by having these different conversations, by leading these different interviews. It shapes how you engage with public speaking, and that can be really fun. It also, you have less pressure to create a solo show, which for a lot of people is a huge mental roadblock to how do I just sit and talk to nobody into a microphone? That can feel really sticky and really uncomfortable. So if you're having an interview, it's a natural back and forth conversation. The downsides to interview-based podcasts are that people cancel, people bail, people don't use microphones, people live in New York and there's a jackhammer going on outside. There are so many more variables in an interview-based podcast that you cannot control that can make it a lot harder. And that's somewhere that you're going to have to plan ahead a lot more and be working further out to account for people who cancel or reschedule or don't give you a great interview. The other con potentially is that this requires really strong interview skills, which you absolutely can build. But if you've never been in a position to be an interviewer, it's definitely a muscle that has to grow, and it can feel really sticky, especially as you're getting started, to lead those conversations, to know how to cut a guest off if they're starting to ramble, to know how to really pull information out of people who kind of want to just give yes or no answers. That's something that can feel really uncomfortable. The other downside is that it becomes harder for your audience to get to know you. And this may not be a big deal if that's not really the point, but if you are also trying to position yourself as an expert, it can be harder to let that happen organically if you're always talking about your guests. Because also, if someone has you on their show and they spend the whole time talking about themselves, that's not a great feeling for the guest. So finding a way to balance adding your own anecdotes, but really letting the guest shine is something that's super important and can be a delicate line to walk. Next, we've got storytelling podcasts, and this can look like Don't Sleep. This can look like the really incredible shows that Emerald Audio Network puts out, where you're following a narrative. There are stories that have a beginning, middle, and end. It's more of that storytelling, less of a conversation. This also has some pros and cons. So on the upside, this is wonderful for people who it can kind of act as a gateway for people who are traditionally audiobook listeners and then become podcast consumers. This was honestly my lead in as a podcast consumer. I was such an audiobook devotee that when I was looking for different content, I started listening to podcasts, and I was listening to, oh man, I'm never going to be able to remember the name of it, but it was this really interesting, like dystopian podcast. Oh gosh. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to remember it, but that also makes me think of like Limetown. And so with the narrative or the fiction podcasts, you also get these really interesting audio dramas like Archive 81, which was actually adapted into a Netflix show a couple years ago and was really good. There's so many different ways that you can spin that. And the pros, like I mentioned, are that, you're really going to capture those audiobook listeners or people who are looking for something different than just the classic kind of nonfiction podcast. And people can become diehard fans for these. These are hella fandom shows that really suck people in. But they can also, they don't have to be the true like audio drama or narrative. You can lean more into, like I mentioned, a Let's Not Meet, which has, micro stories that are being told. The downside to this is these are a labor of love. These are a huge time suck, and I say that lovingly and gently, but they require so much research, so much scripting, sourcing talent, editing. I say it that many times because that is how big of a deal it's going to be, especially if you've got Foley or ambient sounds or you're sourcing different music. There is so much that goes into the mixing, the production, and managing, directing the talent. There's a lot that goes into those type of podcasts, but man, when they are good, they are good. Next is the solo or the monologue podcasts. And, this is a single host sharing their thoughts, opinions, expertise. Spoiler alert, this isn't totally what my show is, but for the most part, that's what you're listening to right now. The nice part about doing a show like this is that you don't need to have guests. You get to make exactly the show you want to make. So if you are a little bit more of a type A, Virgo-y type person like me, that can be really helpful. And it allows you to really follow what feels good for you. The downside is that it feels uncomfortable sometimes. The first episode back since the summer break on this show, I talked about getting confident and building that confidence and how hard it can be to just be you and a microphone talking to a bunch of your pretend best friends. That is definitely a muscle that has to be built, and it can feel really uncomfortable to build it. But there's definitely pros on it. You don't have to worry about guests canceling. You don't have to worry about disagreements with co-hosts. You don't have to worry about time constraints for other people. You get to make your show when you want to make it and how you want to make it. And then there's the panel discussion podcast. And this is, you're My Favorite Murder. This is your My Brother and Me. This is your Salon Confessions. This is where you've got 2 to more hosts who talk about a thing, whatever that topic is. It kind of goes in that like round table format. It's a back and forth. It's a conversation. This can be such a good style of podcast because it gives that dynamic, multi-perspective, conversational feeling that allows you to feel like you're witnessing something, to feel like you are participating in something. And, the back and forth dynamic makes it feel really conversational. This is why, if you're a millennial like me, our moms and us when we were home from school sick would watch The View. It's that same kind of vibe, but in podcasting format. And this can be any type of show, any niche of show. And the line can get a little blurry between like a storytelling podcast, if you are doing like And That's Why We Drink, where, you're bringing stories to the table. There's a lot of blending that can happen, but anytime that you have multiple hosts, you get that jovial, friendly dynamic, which can be great. The downside to this is you are managing more tech, you're managing more microphones, you've got challenges whether you're recording remotely or in the same room, and, balancing other people's schedules. If someone else's kid gets sick or if someone else wants to go out of town, you're also finding out how to break up the different tasks and who's responsible for what, how will we handle finances. You're adding more cooks to the kitchen, which can make that difficult, but it's often a really great listener experience. Some of my favorite shows are kind of the panel discussion style. And then there's the hybrid podcast. And that's kind of what I alluded to that you're listening to right now, because while most of the time I'm by myself, I do love to bring in and highlight other podcasters and other guests. But for the most part, it's just me. So a hybrid is anytime that you have different styles. If you do some interviews and some solos, i.e. Wellness Matters with Heather Carocchio, she is great about doing this. This allows you to go deep with guests when you want to, but it also allows you to talk about the thing that you really love and to drive the conversation. This is also great because it allows you to still position yourself within the podcast without it feeling like you're just talking about yourself and taking away some of the energy from a guest conversation. So if you do want to highlight your own business or your own work, this can be great while still having those conversations with other thought leaders in your niche. The downside of this is you have to be a little bit more intentional about helping orient people, especially new listeners, into what type of show they're signing up for. Is this going to be a one-off guest? Are you often talking solo about a really deep dive on something? What can people expect from your show as they kind of go through your backlog, or if they start listening now and they want to listen continuing forward? Help them orient and help them understand what they're getting themselves into so that it doesn't just feel like a chaotic smorgasbord of content. And so when deciding what kind of style you want to do, assess your strengths. Think about, are you a confident interviewer? Are you scared to talk into a microphone by yourself? Do you love the conversations that you and your bestie have and you want to bring that energy to a podcast? Are you someone who really wants to get in the weeds with tech and do a Foley and background music? And, do you want to really create that storytelling narrative podcast? What feels good? What is your bandwidth too? That's a huge thing to consider is, do you have the bandwidth to take on everything, or would it be easier to you to be able to delegate and spread tasks out to a co-host? And with that, consider your weaknesses. And I know that's hard and we don't want to spend too much time in our not so comfortable spots. But, if you can think to yourself, I'm really not comfortable interviewing. Like that just does not feel good. I'm not comfortable asking people to stop talking. I'm not comfortable with telling people that if they don't have a microphone, we're not going to be able to do the interview today. If you are not comfortable with being assertive in that capacity, that may not be a style that's going to work for you. And then consider your content. What do you want to talk about? If you are somebody who wants to talk about the detriments of fast fashion, then a narrative podcast is probably not going to make a lot of sense for your niche. Consider what your listeners are seeking as well. So let that kind of guide what your conversations are going to look like. If you are trying to talk about like how dangerous fast fashion is, maybe that's an interview podcast. Maybe that's a hybrid podcast where you're partially sharing your experiences and, you can talk about your journey to like, I don't know, minimalism. And then you can bring on ecologists and people who are studying climate change and people in the fashion industry as guests. Think about what makes the most sense for the content that you're making. And then, know your audience. This is something that you have to kind of bet on before you really start seeing it come to fruition. And it's something that, when done well, changes and evolves. Your expectations kind of grow with your show. But at its point of origination, think about who is going to be listening to this and what do they have the bandwidth to listen to? What are they most interested in hearing? And how would they like to consume this? Do they want to hear you bantering with your best friend, or do they want to hear you just getting straight to the facts? Consider that and make sure that it's still the show that you're wanting to make. But if you are looking to do this for more than just a good time, make sure that it is something that's going to feel consumable. As with anything, don't be afraid to experiment. And if you realize this just does not feel like the content I want to be making, you can pivot. Maybe that's why you're here right now. It's always okay to explore new avenues and to make changes and course correct as you learn more about your show, yourself, and your audience. Take feedback into consideration and take what feels good into consideration. If you do this for 3 months and then you go, oh my God, every time that I sit down to have an interview, I like want to pop a Klonopin and cancel. Bestie, it's not worth it. Like, I love you enough to tell you that it's not worth it. Change to a different style. Let that be graceful and feel natural. You don't have to just abruptly be like, yep, I'm not doing this ever again. But, you can be candid with your audience and say, yeah, you know what? It feels really good to have these conversations with my best friend. So moving forward, I'd like to welcome Susie to the podcast. She's going to be my new co-host and I'm so excited for that. Or be transparent and say, it feels really good to have these conversations by myself with you as my listener. And so I'm going to be studying from YouTube videos and TED Talks and whatever to learn. And then I'm going to share that information that I've gathered from experts with you as opposed to speaking with them directly. There are ways to do it to make it feel natural and organic and comfy, but still to make sure that you are holding boundaries for yourself so that you can make a show that feels good. Because at the end of the day, life is too freaking short to make something that hurts to make or doesn't feel so excellent to make. Like, honestly, for me, I have softened the rigidity with which I meet this podcast. Like I said, I spent the first 6 months or so of the show in my nice office that had carpet, and I was very refined and prestigious in how I would show up on mic because that's what felt good at the time. It felt good to separate and have this identity as this like really kind of put together businessy person. And in the season of my life that I'm in now, that's just not as accessible. I've talked some about the lifestyle changes that have happened within my own family. We've moved, my husband's working a lot more, I'm solo parenting a lot more, that honestly, sitting at my desk just doesn't feel good. Like, it just doesn't feel like somewhere that I want to spend a lot of my time. So I'm having these conversations on my couch, and my new house is echoey, and there's a lot of windows, and there's very little carpet, and the sound quality has changed. And I'm just letting that be okay because I'm still doing my due diligence to make the show that feels good. Never be afraid to let your show evolve and pivot and grow and change, because ideally you are doing all of those things too. Okay, I had some other points I was going to make, but that was kind of a like soapboxy tangent moment, and I'm feeling really fired up that that's a good place to leave things. So thank you so much for spending time with me today. Don't be afraid to play. Don't be afraid to make a show that feels good. You can come hang out with me on Instagram at Sonivia Studios. You can shoot me an email if you want to talk more about your podcast at rue.sonivia@gmail.com. You can come hang out with me next week when I am back with a new episode. And in the meantime, be good to yourself. And thank you for helping me take podcasting up an octave.